We do have a very distinguished panel. On my immediate right, Andrew Jenkins, who's the Executive Vice President International for Universal Music Publishing. And we have Jeremy Fabinyi. Jeremy will be well known to many of you, a returning Aussie, having spent the last 10 years in Europe, working firstly for the Confederation of Author Societies and most recently for PRS MCPS, running MCPS, the Mechanical Rights Collecting Society. Jeremy, I should say, in a past life ran AMCOS in Australia, and in a past life was a very well-known band manager and managed such groups as Mental as Anything. Michael Fraser is sitting next to Jeremy. Michael is researcher, teacher, guru. Guru number one.
Is that with a capital G or just a little G?
Capital G. Wow. We've got two, David, you're the second guru, so, you know.
Little G.
Two gurus on the panel. Michael these days is the director of the Communications Law Institute at the University of Technology, previously ran Copyright Agency Limited, which is the literary collecting society for many years. Welcome, Michael. David Touve is, I hope, well known to most of you now. Gave an absolutely brilliant presentation this morning. He's teacher, researcher, guru number 2. And Stephen Navin is also
guru
with us. Guru number 3.
And together we are the 3 gurus.
Yeah. We've almost got the hoodoo guru. Yeah. So Stephen is the Chief Executive of the UK Music Publishers Association. I want to start by asking a question really of several members of the panel, perhaps Andrew, Jeremy and Stephen. The relationship between collecting society members and collecting societies in Europe at the moment is often characterised by great stresses and tensions. And obviously, to some degree, this has come about through the digital licensing practices in Europe. But I wanted to ask each of these 3 panellists where they think those tensions have arisen, where the pressure points are, and why do we think, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, those tensions have arisen. Andrew, do you want to speak first?
Yeah, sure. The thing about writing songs and our business is that when you write a song, you create a global copyright. The moment you finished it, there it is, a global copyright. What has traditionally happened in our business is we've then split it up and exploited that global copyright on a national basis. And so we've had a natural build-up of national collection societies. We are subject, obviously, to national copyright law, but the copyright is essentially a global ownership when you create that copyright. In the internet world, in the digital world, you suddenly move from needing to grant licenses on or you don't have to move that way, but you have moved from needing to grant licenses on a national basis, for example, for shops and restaurants and other purely national activities, into dealing with multinational companies who want to license on a global or at least a multi-territory or regional basis. When the whole business is set up to grant national licenses, this has created a natural conflict. And some societies, some collection societies have been quicker to grasp the potential of the new world and look at the opportunities to expand their business beyond their national borders, and some have refused to embrace it. And so there's a natural conflict in the system. I don't think anyone's by the way, I don't think anyone's to blame for that. Apportioning blame is probably a mistake. It's just, it was always going to happen. It's happened, and in Europe it's probably at its most extreme, because in Europe you have essentially what is legally one market, the European community, the common market as it's called in Europe, and you have 27 at least, and they're growing every year because we keep adding new ones, 27 at least different jurisdictions, all claiming national licensing exclusivity with a single market. So what we have is natural tension in the system, and we're looking for people with vision to move beyond that and find a way to create a world which means we offer the maximum amount of music at the best possible value, and I mean value to the people who create music, not to anyone else, but the best possible value to the creators of music in the fastest possible way with simplified licensing procedures.
Jeremy, do you want to make?
Yeah, well, everything that Andrew's outlined leads to a series where the the collecting societies in Europe, which traditionally have been, I won't say a fraternity, well, not necessarily a close community, but at least have had strong reciprocal relationships and have been working more or less together. Certainly a few strains in the process, but more or less working together. And now they've been thrown into direct competition one to the other, and that is causing enormous problems. And as Andrew points out, 27 societies or 27 countries, and this vision of a single market, but it's not really a single market. Copyright is being administered. It's not only the national copyright laws, it's the way in which copyright is being administered is on a local basis. And of course, you've got different copyright laws, you've got different VAT regimes, different withholding taxes, and of course, you've got different languages as well. So it is incredible tension that is existing in the European market at the moment, and that's something which we need to avoid. There's no question that the way in which the whole society network is operating is going through a period of immense change. And use the classic cliche, challenges are abounding. Plenty of challenges there. And it's also true that there's a pretty good chance that some of the societies that have relied on and have assumed they will forever have a right to rule, that those societies may not in fact survive into the future. It's also true that there are good societies, there are bad societies, and there are absolutely appalling societies. I've been my career is about support for collective licensing, and I don't resolve from that for a second. But there are circumstances where you have to say, things need to change. Things need to change at those societies that are performing particularly badly. But things need to change also for the large societies that, in the main, they have their problems, they have their challenges, but in the main, they actually produce enormous value and bang for the buck. But they need to change, and it's a time of immense change, time of immense disruption, time of immense uncertainty, and that creates an enormously interesting time to have worked in Europe. But I'm glad to be out of there.
In introducing Jeremy, I stupidly neglected to say that he's just been appointed the head of the Australian Music Publishers Association. Australasian Music Publishers Association. I think I'd get that right.
I think I saw a New Zealander in the audience.
Stephen, I'm going to slightly vary your question. We've heard a bit about the specific circumstances of the common market in Europe. Do you think the tensions in Europe between collecting societies and publisher members in particular have arisen solely because of aspects of the common market, or do you think there is something inherently in the nature of the relationship between publishers and collecting societies that is also at play?
Well, yes, I was preparing to answer the question, segueing on from the two lads, which I'm going to do, but I'll try to answer your first bit first. I mean, the common market, it is, I think I mentioned the other day, we are about to get a directive on, we're going to get a directive on collective rights management. And it's going to be therefore it's a directive which comes from the European Commission. The European Commission is conscious of the fact that one of the barriers to a digital Europe is partly the responsibility of the failure to enable a digital marketplace to work on a pan-European basis. And in the spotlight, there are various things, there are various aspects that are in the spotlight. Copyright as a concept is perceived in some quarters as a barrier, but there's indubitably one of the barriers is perceived as being the fact that you have these fiefdoms. You have a 19th century type of German state situation across Europe where you have... Hello? Sorry?
The Third Reich is calling. The German state is calling.
It's the directive coming through.
It must be Bismarck.
It's Nelly Kroes.
It's Nelly Kroes again.
Yeah.
So I think there is that sense. I mean, again, I think there are powerful forces pressing on us, which are forcing us, whether wittingly or unwittingly, willingly or involuntarily, that we have to be making changes to bring about a marketplace, not just for the accommodation of writers and publishers and collection societies, for the accommodation of the market. And those are very strong driving factors now. And we certainly in the United Kingdom, I think as I said, our law, the UK law of intellectual property and the way we do business using copyright is determined by Europe. To some extent, the British government is just a small outpost of Europe. And Brussels tells us what to do. But this kind of goes to the second, kind of come back to the point I was thinking about quite strongly. What I've noticed is that once upon a time, there was a conflict, if you wish, between writer and publisher. And there was often the polemic put forward that it was actually the collection society was always the writer's friend, and the writer would defer, believe in, trust in the collection society rather than their publisher. And there's no question there were bad times where I think the relationship with writers and publishers but now, I mean, I've been in the MPA for 6 years, and I was absolutely amazed that the partnership now that exists in terms of when deals are cut between publishers and writers, it is absolutely a partnership which is built upon trust and equity, and the equity is always in favor of the writer in terms of their deal making. So my sense is that writers put much more trust in publishers, and they see publishers, particularly, and I see this within the body of our collection in terms of it is the publishers who direct in a complicated digital environment who are actually driving forward the deals based upon their experiences. It's an incredible combination of cooperation. And so, and the point I'm making by this is that the writers, if you wish, are very happy to think, hold on, maybe what we see, our collection society is not as wonderful as it may have been once upon a time. Now we see there are other alternatives that are out there. Now we see there are other sorts of efficiencies that we should be adhering to. I mean, put it in its crudest sense. If I'm a writer and I want somebody to administer my copyrights for me, I want to have some idea what the cost of that is going to be, and I'd like to have some sort of control over putting a cap on that cost. And so I think there is much more of a partnership between the publisher and the writer now, to some extent putting pressure on the collective to get its house more in order. And I think the global repertoire database conversation is a very good case in point. There is a tremendous amount of cooperation between the writer community and the publisher community.
I'm going to come back and ask you about the specifics of the relationship and where you think those specifics can be improved. But I want to turn to David for a minute. David, of course, is a great researcher and commentator on the digital age and technology, particularly insofar as it impacts on copyright owners and writers and so on. David, I wonder what your view of this incredibly technological world we now live in is about this institution, the Collecting Society, which was formed more than 100 years ago in terms of its concept and was established to enable writers to get paid for the playing of their theatrical pieces or pieces of music in cafes and so on. What do you think about this institution that seems to be still so fundamental to the way we do business?
Well, that's a good question. I guess we have, middle 1800s France, right? That sort of, I mean, I think what's amazing about collectives is how, for lack of a better word, accidentally, it was done really well. It was basically addressing a concern where people were making music, and the music was being performed in other venues, and they couldn't stop it from being performed in these other venues, right? So the choice was stop it or find a way to sort of collect it and license it. So it really was, when you think about it, it's able to adapt from that basic core concept to just about anything we can imagine. It's frightening, I think, when people imagine that, because we imagine it first happening. There's 100 clubs in Paris back in 1850. At least that's what I remember. No, I'm just kidding. And there's no way you're going to know exactly what's going on in all those, and you don't have webcams at that point in time to monitor it, or fans posting set lists to Songkick or different sources like that. So you can't gather that data. But they sort of took a leap and said, we'll license it and gather the best data we can around the use of work. And that was really extremely forward-thinking, right? It was frightening, I think, also because from a songwriter's perspective, it does sort of eliminate the right to say no from the start. And I know that's difficult for songwriters. The idea that you make a work, once the work is in fixed form, was it Missy Keegan, when she said a song is done when she's performed it, right? I'm like, that's going to be interesting, because when it's performed, it hasn't yet really entered the world where other people could record it, right? As long as it's just performed, it sort of is in this gray area. But once it's been recorded, you sort of lose control over the work that you've made. And that's a difficult position, I think, for songwriters to be in, yet collectives are in a great position to sort of make the best of that.
Well,
situation.
this was what I just wanted to explore with you. I often wondered whether a composer standing at the gateway to Paris in the 1850s was more frightened about the way his or her music would be used and what would happen to it than a composer standing in front of the internet is today. And I wondered whether there was a thematic connection between your comments this morning about graduated response. Maybe the solution is not to say no and to close down. Maybe the solution is somehow to partner. And of course, that's what the collecting societies did. That was the big leap in the early days. We're not going to say no, we're going to say yes, but there's a social bargain as part of the transaction. And I just wondered whether that was a thematic connection.
So I'm very cautious when I do things like that because I know graduated response is also a political issue. And for a songwriter to lose control, or even a recording artist, an owner, whatever, to lose control over their work, that's a massive thing. That's a massive event, right? And you have to respect that as something that is just powerfully difficult. But it is, and I usually just do that just to get people to ask the question. It's sort of like, it's so economically rational, right? What is worth more? Or what is ultimately the more reasonable solution? And it's worth for people just to sort of think about that. There's some value to the work that people do in this sort of unhindered environment. It's difficult to find it, but it's an amazing premise too. As frightening as it is from a songwriter's perspective, it's amazing that when you finish a work, it can go be recorded by other people and kind of have its own way. You know, up to the 50s in the US, it was far more common. Like she was talking about two artists having the same song out. It was far more common like that back in the US, right? A song would hit the radio and then it would be re-recorded, and it had this life of its own. And it's funny how everything has those two faces, right?
Michael, you've now had a little bit of distance from your career in a collecting society. You're now an objective observer of the landscape that we inhabit. What are your views or conclusions now about the future of collecting societies?
We've got to say yes. The idea of control, you've got to give that up. You've got to say yes and meet the consumer demand to be able to get the work and do what they want with it. Saying no is like standing in front of a moving train. It just can't happen. And in any case, it's not what composers and musicians and performers want to do. They want their music out there by all these means. So the challenge is to facilitate it in a lawful way so that the value of the creative work is recognized, but the consumer demand for instant access to all kinds of content, not only music, but multimedia content, and the ability to use it and reuse it, that demand is something that creative people ought to be supporting, so long as their rights and their livelihood is respected. I think the idea of collective management has to adapt yet again, from one night in Paris to centralized individual rights management. Because the idea of chasing around cafes was impossible, and finding out about each work. So you try and make a market, a recovery market, by having some broad brush approach of collective management. But in a digital age, if content can flow one way, rights information can flow the other way. And whether it's the publisher or a rights management organization, they've got to manage individually for their members these rights in a far more specific individual rights management market, and offer new products and services for their members and for the community. There's one thing I'd like to add, Brett, and that is that the European Union is making the running with these directives, and we wait, with bated breath, what is the new directive that's going to come down from the European Commission. I think it's time that here in the Asia-Pacific region, we also adopted a far more integrated regional approach, and maybe APRA and other leading organisations could play a role.
I'm going to ask Andrew about that in a minute, but before I do, can I just explore with you this idea of the centralised individual management approach?
Yeah.
I just wonder, given our experience in the music industry with millions and millions of micropayments for individuals, the licensing transactions themselves may be individual transactions rather than collective transactions. But because of the very small sums of money and the absurdity of having those small sums of money dispersed hundreds of thousands of different ways into different bank accounts, how does the model really change all that much in that context?
Yeah, I think the same in the market for the consumer. They may not want to be paying, fractions of a cent for each transaction. So there may be overarching a subscription model or an advertising model, a whole range of models. But the data that comes in needs to be aggregated and dealt with reasonably, not for every fraction of a cent to be distributed at the cost of $1. But that is an administrative and a technical matter. I think in an environment, a globalized network communications environment where everything is just zeros and ones, the ability at the base might be transparent to the copyright owner and the user, but at base to be able to track usages and repurposing and reuses is the obvious way now to manage a market, rather than say, as before, well, the market has failed, the creator can't transact with the cafe owner individually, so we'll put some rough approximation in place. We've got to do better than that now and make a real market for rights, but it's obviously got to be cost effective without chewing up more money than you're collecting and distributing.
Yeah. Can I follow on that real quick? Because I think besides just moving to the shift to yes, because I think collectives in general have a history of saying yes more so than in ways, it's sort of how you say yes. I think on the technology side, it's treated as if these folks know the future, have an understanding of the future, have an envision of it, and that is where we are headed. And I don't think on the ground level that's totally bullshit. It's not. We're just randomly trying to create cool stuff and see what works. And so you have to be able to say yes in a context where both parties actually won't know the consequences. So you have to do each project and learn. And that's very different. I mean, from a technology side, that's what we're very accustomed to, making experiments. I mean, just build stuff in such a way that you can learn. And I know that it's more difficult from a licensing perspective to do that because you don't know how the payments will come in. You have responsibilities to songwriters, to all your members. And yet, it's not the wild, wild west. It's sort of just this new thing, and we have to learn about it.
It's a really interesting point. In the commentary on the development of digital models, copyright often gets accused of being the obstacle to these development of these businesses. I'm damned if I can think of a single business that has been actually stopped in its tracks in terms of the use of music or indeed audiovisual content through copyright. It's just extraordinary to me how so many of these businesses have developed and evolved and been conceptualised and so on, gone to market, and then later have dealt with the content issue, the rights issue. YouTube, of course, being the most incredible example. And it just seems to me to be such a fiction in the real world, that argument about copyright as an obstacle. That's more in the nature of a comment than a question.
I'd just comment on your comment.
Is that a meta comment?
Do it, Tony Jones. I hear a lot of that, and it's sort of this general argument across the economy about red tape and regulation, and now this copyright obstacle is another piece of red tape that we have to do before we can do this cool thing. It's a property right. It's not just some bureaucratic box ticking exercise. It's you guys' intellectual property.
Absolutely. Steve?
Can I make a comment
Please.
on a comment? On
Not a comment.
No comment. Just interesting. 'Cause I'm interested in the idea of that because we have been. Again, I hate to keep on mentioning the UK, but it's all I can really mention with any real confidence. But we have been undergoing this analysis of our intellectual property world by the government. They are advocating the simple route is to give exceptions, insist on exceptions to copyright. But they have appointed one of the propositions that came forward was this idea of the digital copyright exchange. And they appointed a particular individual to worry it through, to think about it, and see what that might mean. Could you have sort of like a Tower of Babel where you would have all of the creative industry's rights into this great tower, and people would be coming in one side and then be going out the other end with a license, and there'd be money coming back in. And I think what he's discovered that it actually is that the problems. It's not an issue about copyright, as Brett was saying as such. It is more about sort of what you're saying in terms of how do you, with the possibilities, the immense possibilities that digitization brings, both in terms of your ability to license transactionally and account in micro sums of money. If we can get that right, but you need extraordinary kit, technology to be able to deliver that kind of that utopian environment. And I think that's what this gentleman, Mr. Richard Hooper, I think he's exploring what is available at the moment, what we're doing at the moment to bring about that kind of back office, the wiring, how much wiring is being put together to bring about that kind of environment where the composer, although you can't say no specifically, but you can actually transact in accordance with the reasonable parties, rather than to have a sort of a yes/no type of approach to it. So,
a question for a double header for you. You talked a bit about this clash between the fact that we now live in a borderless world, at least so far as intellectual property is concerned, but the collecting societies are set up on national bases, on national mandates. My question is, how do you see that tension resolving itself in Europe in the near future? And then, picking up Michael's concept, how do you see that concept being transplanted into the Pacific Rim and Asia, particularly given that there isn't a single market situation in that part of the world?
Well, I think the first thing we need to recognise is this didn't start with digital. We talk about it. We talk about this as the digital problem, and of course, it didn't start with digital. It existed before. If you want to talk, Spotify perhaps accounting to Universal on 2.5 billion lines of data for one period. That seems like an awful lot. But of course, if you look at the music performed in cafes around the world, that's a lot more. There are a lot more bits of data. We dealt with this. We dealt with radio programming. We found ways to allocate even when there wasn't accurate data. Now we have more accurate data, and we may find ways to process it more accurately. But actually, the idea of tiny, tiny payments always existed. It was always a situation that the collective had to deal with. In Europe as well, and going back to Brett's question, it wasn't digital that created the idea that you needed to license across borders. This already happened in mechanical rights licensing as a result of certain record companies deciding that it was a single market for Europe, and they wanted to find a way to organise the business. But what happened was the collection societies themselves at that point took the initiative in creating a structure that enabled pan-European licensing for the major users of rights, being the record companies at that time, to operate. The problem with digital is that no one has taken the lead. No one has done that. So it sort of had to evolve in Europe, and it's been painful because everyone, using the word Stephen used, the fiefdoms, everybody wants to preserve their own patch, and nobody's been prepared to give ground at all. In the same way that it happened for mechanical rights licensing fairly easily and fairly logically. There was a proposal many, many years ago, an actual long negotiation for a digital MOU between publishers and collection societies. I was unfortunately part of those negotiations for, believe it or not, 10 years, and it failed in 2002. So we started in 1992 talking about how to create a digital MOU for Europe so the rights could flow in a similar way, or in a way, a simple way, in the same way they did for mechanical rights licensing. The failure was because of the national ownership of certain rights in Europe, the performing rights essentially, and national societies who weren't going to see an immediate benefit from that licensing were reluctant to include their rights in any scheme. Now we've probably gone beyond that. We're now in a situation where in Europe it's recognised, and the Commission is perhaps leading this in some ways, that we need to find a solution, that there need to be simplified processes. The collective rights management business is not immune from the impact of as other businesses are, to efficiencies created by technology. It shouldn't be immune from those things. It should embrace them. And we have, as Jeremy said, some good collecting societies. We have some bad collecting societies and maybe some awful collecting societies. We need to see the movement towards the efficient collection societies taking on greater responsibility, taking on a more regional or multi-territory role rather than a national role, and creating the right licensing environment for the benefit of all songwriters. I fully expect to see, and I don't think we should just talk about Europe, I think it's a mistake to talk about Europe now in sitting here. I would expect to see in the Asia-Pacific region certain collection societies step up to the mark and lead the way, and I expect APRA to be one of those that leads the way into finding a new way of licensing the rights that need to be licensed on a multi-territory basis. I'm not talking about necessarily cafes and restaurants. Perhaps that will always be licensed on a national basis, although I hope with a global repertoire database we will at least have, which will create a single centre for identifying musical works in a way that they haven't been properly identified before. I think we will be able to create an opportunity for the efficient collection societies, those who have the vision to license and distribute monies properly, to be able to have access to data so that they can move beyond the national confines their database restricts them to, and actually move into licensing in a bigger territory. I think it's to encourage the good ones and leave the less efficient societies with national-only licensing, which may continue for a while, but it's to encourage the good ones in the same way you encourage the good businesses around the world to move forward with great business models. I think we need to see the collection societies embrace this now.
I think there's some context for that. I mean, so the copyright exchange and then sort of the GRD and projects like that, I believe there are between 40 and 50 million works registered in across the collectives globally. So, and that may or may not count song A that is sort of registered in different ways or different people in different countries. So having spent my primary years on a trading floor, we can't trade 40 different products. And that again is the role of the collective. I mean, whether it's a market failure or not, that's some serious transacting. And I think people need to understand that a slow yes is kind of like a no in the licensing world. So you brought up the YouTube. In the US, this is probably a sin for me to say this, it operated legally from the start by just playing, we have the DMC, we have our rules. The challenge is those rules didn't apply everywhere else in the world. And when it tries to get to the I'd like to license stuff, it's now at this scale where it needs to license everything, right? Because it's not in control of everything uploaded. And that's frightening. If I want to open up iTunes, I kind of know what I want. I want 15 or 28 million tracks, and maybe you can find it. 28 million tracks, by the way, is less than 40 to 50 million, right? Potential registered works. So now you're in this world where, in theory, you need everything. And if you don't have the I word, the indemnity word, when you get kind of everything, then you're still exposed to that one work that gets uploaded. So we have this DMCA thing, right? Plus we have these massive statutory damages. So it's a tough, I think it's important, like I'm doing work now sort of looking at how long it takes for people to get licenses in the whole process. And understanding why the process plays out the way that it is, as opposed to the usual sort of gunslinging, it's your fault. It's important to understand that the time that it's taking is difficult in the technology world. You have things like an Instagram, they're growing to 50 million, 40 million users in a year and a half, which is about the time it takes
Yeah.
to do licenses.
Yeah, but can't let that one go. I mean, the issue with YouTube, of course, YouTube, lots of issues there. But if YouTube don't actually want to pay, you can do all the licensing you like in the world, but in that sort of environment, if they don't actually want to pay, you get to a point where things don't really work out the way they should. Now, just saying yes and then saying and whatever you like, whatever little shekel you want to give me along the way, that's fine. I don't know that that's the solution to our problems going forward. We have to find a more coherent way in which to do it. I'm not really warm about Google myself.
No,
having
it's
been
great
involved
because
in negotiations with
I
them
walk right
at
in the
some
middle
point.
of those two entities, so I've done stuff for both, and it's dangerous in the middle. I can assure you, I get shot.
Yeah, well,
I get shot. But and I think that is ultimately the tough trigger with copyright, right? You ultimately defend it in the courts. And that's not really the case with everything that we buy and sell in the world. And that makes it tough for you all to try to say, hey, these are our rights. We'd like something and fair compensation for it, but you got to play that out in the courts. And that's not that's not a great venue, right?
I just want to, before I ask for any questions from the floor, I just want to explore two other areas, really. The other theme in terms of the future for collecting societies on the writer side, where it's increasingly, as we know, a do-it-yourself world in many respects. Make your own recording, perhaps do your own publishing, your own distribution, your own marketing promotion, build your own niche audience, and you can theoretically sustain a career in that area. Can I ask you, Jeremy, in that sort of world, do you think the role of the collecting society is changing fundamentally?
Well, I think the question comes back is what is the fundamental role of the collecting society? And I think for many of the collecting societies, they see their fundamental role as being large organisations with a lot of power and a lot of, the bigger you are, the more important you are, and that's your role. And really, it comes, for collecting society, it's got to come down to essentially servicing your members. That's got to be the focus of what it is you do. And whether that means that you need to build an entire infrastructure yourself in order to do that, whether that's the most effective way in which you can service your members, I think that's gone. I think that's over. I think that's the way of the past. And the way now is to say, if you can find a way to get some of your back office services delivered in a more coherent and more economical and more efficient way, you need to embrace that. And most societies, a lot of societies, are not embracing that because they see that there'll be a smaller organisation, the CEO will get less pay. These are important things that feed into it, and that's driving it. So for collecting societies, it's a question of coming back and saying, what are the things that only we can do? And I think it will long be the case that the collecting societies will be the only one to deal with issues of national culture and national language. I mean, the idea that a British society or American society is going to license a cafe in Hungary ain't going to happen. National licensing of whether it's at the cafe level or the national broadcaster level, there is clearly a role for a national collecting society to play there. And for a Hungarian writer will want to be with Hungarian society. What services that society provides for them is the issue, but those services have got to be broader than just being this traditional organisation that holds the rights for everything and ekes it out. In terms of the DIY culture, though, I have to say, and I've been accused of being a bit of a Luddite in this regard, in that, I think that the idea that, the new environment enables everybody to suddenly be stars by creating their own things in their own backyard and becoming, superstars, I can't think of a single example where that's actually happened yet. Now, of course, things have changed, the way in which the business works have changed, you have to embrace all of that change, but the fundamentals still apply. You've got to have a great song, you've got to have great production, you've got to have great marketing. Now, that marketing can be through social networking, can be any sort of way you want, but the fundamentals still apply, and you're still competing in a global market for very limited attention. A recent survey says, where do most people discover music? Answer, radio. You don't discover new music on Spotify. You go to Spotify because you want to hear what you want to hear, not to hear what you don't want to hear or what you don't want to find, in the main. Radio has its flaws as well.
If I want to listen to discover some old Ryan Adams records, I'm not going to go to radio to try and. I'm going to go to Spotify or Audio or iTunes, aren't I?
Yes, but if you want to discover something that you don't know what you want and you're going to listen to it for the first time, listening to your old stuff or the people you already know, yes, sure, that's the role for those sort of services. But discovering something new and exciting and different, I don't know that those are necessarily the correct mediums. Now, as I say, some accuse me of being a Luddite.
J'accuse.
Stephen, can I ask you, before I go to the floor, in 20 words or less, what to,
Sorry.
what to collect, this is a real challenge, what do collecting societies really need to do better to survive and thrive in the future, do you think?
They need to listen to their members, both publishers and writers, to achieve complete certainty that their business model works.
Hey!
I knew you could do it. Brilliant.
You need to keep that qualification on every question for Stephen.
That's right. Do we have any questions from the floor?
Wasn't that only
Yes.
15?
I thought it was 20.
Maybe just head up to the
I was counting
microphone.
my fingers. I'm not very
yeah.
good at math. But
Just wondering, in the publishing world, the example of Merlin for master recordings. Universal does global licensing, and the majors do global licensing, but for the, let's say the 20% with still some major, the 80% on the long tail 20/80 thing, with some major hits, has it been discussed, pardon my ignorance, at CSAC or at the society level that the global licensing can operate more in the Merlin factor with societies working with the non-major or the non-global publishing companies?
Well, the interesting thing about Merlin is that Merlin is not in direct competition with the sound recording collecting societies. The sound recording collecting societies still have their fundamental business, which is licensing the national broadcasters and licensing, again, the public performance rights and so forth. So Merlin is playing a very different role there, and I think that goes to the heart of what I was saying, which is that in terms of some of that fundamental activity that takes place, you will not replace the collecting societies. It might change, it might be different arrangements, but that's not a direct challenge to the existing collecting societies. Now, whether there will be a equivalent of a Merlin for musical works, I don't think that will happen. Musical work ownership is so fragmented that, at least with the sound recording, you own the sound recording. With musical works, there can be 12 writers, and it's not the product that's actually being bought and sold. That's why it's much easier for Merlin and for the record companies to be operating in that environment. They actually have a product that they're selling. We have the underlying rights, which we need to manage and administer.
Thank you. Yeah, I think to give that scale, there's about 20, because I just had to do a project trying to understand, and you get anywhere from between 5,000 to 7,000 publishing parents. So that's not calling major publishers, that's like some entity that represents a bunch of publishing entities. And it scales quickly to 30,000 as you start to get past that 50 to 70% of the music consumed in a service or on a store. And then if you were to hit the individuals, you get to 150 to 200,000. And that's just in the US. So to make a Merlin even for the publishing world, that's a project. That's a big challenge.
Andrew.
And I just want to clear up something. Universal doesn't issue global licenses for the most part. We do work through the collective for very much that reason, because there are so many partners in any song we control, or might be, that it is much more efficient to license through the collective. What we're trying to do is make the collectives work more effectively and to grant licenses for bigger territories, but the intention is not to license universal works separately.
Yeah, and also just going back to the very first question, I mean, one of the tensions that exists, and it exists very strongly, is the tension amongst the publisher and the sub-publisher. Because just like the copyright societies have carved out different markets, so writers have found it very convenient to parcel their rights up and appoint sub-publishers, hopefully on non-cross-collateralised deals with big advances from each particular territory. But suddenly in this pan-European or regional world, that raises some very big questions about the role of the sub-publisher. We touched on one of the other panels before, and I think the cliche was that the good sub-publishers will thrive and the bad sub-publishers will have no reason to exist, really.
Yep. Other questions?
It all sounds really nefarious to me, like it's really hard to understand. It's really difficult to interpret, and it doesn't mean anything to me. I want to know, how do I get
How do I get a publishing deal?
How do you get it?
Good question.
In fact,
Do you
the
know
way,
any?
the way the publishers are looking for new talent has changed dramatically. And I think while I agree with Jeremy in terms of perhaps the way the consumer behaviour may not have changed as much as we think it has as a result of the internet, but the discovery of talent certainly has.
Yeah.
I think that vehicles like YouTube and other vehicles like that become incredibly important now for alerting publishing companies to new talent that they may not find because you can't attend every gig, every showcase, every pub, everywhere in the world. So something's changed at that creative end. And I think that's probably the biggest benefit we've seen, or the biggest change in our business we've seen. I mean, it's not something we've talked about on this panel. It's not really been the focus of it. But actually what has changed is we probably do a lot more research on the internet than we ever imagined doing any other way before.
Yeah, that's changed, but I still say, going back from when I started in the business, it was still the same basic principle. As an artist, as a songwriter, you still have to create your market. Now, whether you do it in those days by creating a live market or whatever, and these days you're doing it in social networking, but the basic premise still remains. The idea, of course it's changed when you've got The Voice and various other talent shows coming down and plucking a star out of the sky, but in the main it's about doing the hard work, about creating a product, and creating a market. And that's what you've always got to do, I think.
And I think if you're looking to find some sort of legitimacy in music, amongst music publishers, how do you decide which one's right for you or which one would be interesting to you? It really still comes back to doing your research. I think you look at the National Music Publishers Associations, you look at the members of those associations who buy into certain, there may not be an actual code of conduct, but there is an implied code of conduct, a way to behave. So I think you do a bit of research, you look at those people who are part of those bodies and cooperate in industry initiatives, and you think they're probably going to offer me a reasonably good service within, and it's probably going to be on a fairly level playing field.
But I think maybe one of those questions, part of that question might be, do you actually still need a publisher? Of course, it's the answer. Of course, it's the answer.
Do you know there's something very interesting about that? Again, I know I keep saying the business hasn't changed very much, because it hasn't changed very much. I mean, we get wound up with the digital world as though it's made some huge difference. I think it's made a huge difference to consumers and possibly the way we discover talent. But in terms of a lot of what we do, nothing's really changed. And in terms of self-publishing, certainly nothing has changed. Because in America, for example, it has, for many, many years, certainly as long as I've been in the music business, which is, anyway, you don't want to know how long that is, but it's a very long time, the idea of owning your own publishing company and then sub-publishing outside of the US has been a very strong part of the way the business is organized in the US. I mean, we represent around the world, or even just for one or two territories, famous songwriters who have their own publishing companies, Bruce Springsteen, whatever. They don't sign to a major publisher for the world. This is not a new model. So managing your own publishing is not a new model. It's something the business has dealt with for 50 to 60 years. A lot of these things aren't new. They're just, we're being forced to think about them and I think the thing the internet has done, or all digital services have done, it's speeded up the process.
Yeah.
We've had to think about it quicker, and we're not used to adapting. I mean, we're talking about a publishing, we talk about collection societies being 150 years old. We actually own a publishing company that's 211 years old. Music publishing started way, way back, long before collection societies.
2000 BC.
That's right. Michael, you wanted to
And Stephen
say
was
that?
there.
That's right.
I started it.
Yeah, it worries me that while we have this expertise, for many musicians, copyright on which their livelihood depends is a mystery, and for the community at large, it's fallen into disrepute. Let's say there's lack of respect for intellectual property in works of the mind. And as the market has disintegrated from this mass medium market, we have to make copyright work more simply. We're talking about the complexities of music, but consumers want music and audiovisual and written words. They want to get rights for all of that. And so I think from the consumer's perspective, the idea that you have to go and talk to a performing rights society and then get a mechanical rights, and then you may have to get reproduction rights from Cal and audiovisual rights from someone else in all different kinds of ways, while you're building up a multi-billion-dollar business based on those rights in a year, or just because you're an individual who wants to use them, is just not good enough. And as the market disintegrates, I think what we have to do is to bundle together rights so that they can be, all the fiefdoms may exist, continue to exist, but we've got to form some umbrellas to make it as easy to do the right thing as it is to pirate.
Yep.
And I think that's for us. And on the musician side, it's the reality. So if either you've got to get good at it, or you've got to appoint somebody who is good at it to do it for you, and find out whether that's the publisher or the collecting society or an agent, because that's the business.
I think we're almost out of time, but we have time for perhaps one or two more questions. Oh, I'm sorry. Hang on. One up there.
Yes.
Please.
Hi, my name's Joanna Lee. I am noticing a really big change from 2 years ago in the tone from the industry and APRA towards online sort of distribution. Last time it was very much, let's stop the pirates, was the tone that I was getting through, which I felt was quite behind the actual practices of the Gen Y, Gen X sort of people that I'm kind of on the borderline of. And I find it really interesting, sorry, I didn't catch everyone's names at the beginning, sort of the comments about being a Luddite and people just getting new music through radio when, if I want to get new music, I look at what my friends are, posting on Facebook or Twitter, or I'll actively ask for that. So I'm just curious as to, how the industry and collection societies are keeping up with, what the active consumers in the music industry, if I look around here, there's a dozen people on iPhones and iPads, doing that. So what are you doing to keep on top of how people are actually consuming music rather than it feels like it's really behind?
So I think these really matter. So that question I'm ultra sensitive to, because you have the artist of one asking a question about their career, and a collective. I tend to work with that level. It's like it's capital M music. It's like all music, and it actually matters a great deal, because particularly for a country like Australia, where you're not quite a net exporter of music, but a clear exporter of music, that the way, and then when you think of online, when people are consuming music the way that they are online. Because now all these international agreements, these reciprocal rights, all of these things actually matter a great deal when you imagine that you could publish a song, post it somewhere online. In a country like the UK, someone might actually take the song, stick it with a video, publish it to YouTube in the UK, and it would actually be licensed as a sync because of the blanket that they've done there, a blanket that doesn't exist everywhere else. So I think it's important to understand that when, as an individual musician, the global use of your creativity matters perhaps more now earlier in your career than it may have before. And those reciprocal rights, which are, let's be honest, complicated, right? Messy. These strange acronyms, GRDs and things like that, these are all part of this attempt to try to make sense of this, such that even for an individual artist, these really broad concepts finally actually matter, and you can see that on a statement. I do know the UK has a unique relationship with YouTube in the sense that, although it's problematic now, where essentially that putting a song with a video was licensed as a blanket way. That wasn't done that way in the US and other places, and it got a little fuzzy. I mean, right?
So, it's complicated.
Yeah, it gets and yet these are the uses of music in that environment. And I know that there are different studies in different places actually actively trying to find ways to license that.
Well, I think the short answer to the question is that what's happened in the last few years is the emergence of services, digital services, which want to have licenses and are prepared to operate lawfully and to pay a reasonable share of what the revenue they generate to copyright owners. And that's really been the big change. I think there is a level of suspicion amongst the copyright industries around the world of the idea of simply saying no and trying to shut down unlawful distribution on the internet. On the other hand, I think it's really important that there be a carrot and stick approach, that the people who want to set up legitimate business models and pay artists are not competing the whole time with people who don't want to do that and are just allowed to run free. You know, it's really important that both weapons are used. Issue licenses on the one hand, but try and do something about the unlawful operators. And we've all evolved, I think, in our attitudes towards that. Now, is there any final comment that anyone on the panel... One more question. Yeah. Sorry, Ben?
Very briefly, touching on what Brett said about businesses that are using the copyright obstacle as a bit of a smokescreen, and what Stephen was saying about getting better at trying to license these kinds of activities. Two businesses that I've looked at for an example, SoundCloud and Bandcamp, who on the face of it both appear to be the independent musician's friend. However, they're asking you to assert that you have not assigned your rights to any performing rights organisation before you use the service, which is counterintuitive. Obviously, if you're going to release product, you want it to get on radio, you want to be able to collect the royalties. I just wondered if the panel might comment on that, and how do we better engage with those types of businesses that spring up very quickly and very quickly become a de rigueur way of promoting your musical activities?
I think you need to give whoever the rights they need for their service if you're confident that they can deliver value to you, and no more.
Is it true? So SoundCloud, I'm going to guess, is the one you're mentioning, where if you upload... Okay, if you upload a recording, it wants you to say that you're not a member? Yeah. All right, so, and if you are a member, then what do you do?
It's 60% of the content on there is from people who are members of the PRO. I mean, Swift John Stevens has his whole catalogue on Bandcamp now. Published writer through ASCAP, so it's a bit of a Wild West approach to it.
And they're backed by Flatiron. So I think, I mean, this is tough because I'm not old in the music industry, but my first attempt online was a licensed music service in like '98, and it was impossible to license that, right? So the people that want to do licenses are out there. I think the biggest challenge here is just the balance. It's just that sucks, right? If someone's asking you to do that online, but it's only going to change if you become actively involved, voice your opinion, and really try to understand the interests of both sides, because the answer is almost always in the middle, some place of balance. It's so hard to find that. Yeah.
Stephen?
Just I mean, because this has been, I've really enjoyed being, I mean, it's so fantastic. Everybody in this room, out there, everybody is in the business of creating music. Image, I mean, to listen to Imogen Heap and to listen to Missy there before. I mean, it's fantastic, but it's their business, their profession. Everybody wants to make money and a career out of this business. And as you say, copyright is a property right. So let's focus on our number one priority, which is I want to get some value in this business. So we have to be very, very messianic about this. And so if we, there's an organization called Epidemic, for example, which is growing out of Sweden, which in fact is actually signing up songwriters. And again, similarly, and the deal is you do not become a member of any collection society. You get paid €70, I think is the deal for your song, and they will then do a license to, for example, STIM, I think, not STIM, to the Swedish broadcaster has taken a license. So actually Channel 5, which is one of the least successful, but it's commercial channels in the UK. They are looking to acquire music in this way. But I think, it's up to us. We are, as publishers, we go into business with a coin in our hands, with a composer on one side of the coin and the publisher on the other side. And we've got to generate value. So we've got to be absolutely clear about this, that we will license. I mean, the publisher's mantra is license, license, license. But you're not going to license for nothing. You're going to want a license for value. Every business opportunity that is created online, just because it's got the words digital before it, or in the midst of it, doesn't mean to say that it's any better than any other business plan, or it has some sort of protective skin around it, which means that you have to give your rights for nothing. We need to. That's what I mean. We have got to get value for our songwriters. Your careers depend upon that, it seems to me, and that's what we need to do.
On that messianic note,
come on!
I think a perfect note to wind up the session, and I'd like you all to say thank you to our panellists. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you, guys.
We're going to storm the Bastille now. We're going to storm the castle.